Preston Hawthorne had just grabbed the industrial scissors from the art room when Susie Carter walked into Willowbrook Academy's main hallway at 7:45 a.m., her natural coils bouncing with each step. Within 60 seconds, those same scissors would slice through her hair while 200 students watched in stunned silence. But what happened next would turn Preston from predator to prey in the most unexpected way. The son of Ashford Springs' most powerful family was about to learn that some girls carry weapons far more dangerous than any blade. The truth? Before we dive into this incredible story of courage and justice, I want to take a moment to connect with you, our amazing community. If you've ever felt powerless, been bullied, or witnessed injustice that made your blood boil, this story is for you. And if it resonates with you, if it makes you angry, hopeful, or inspired, please hit that like button and share your own experiences in the comments below. Your stories matter, and they help others know they're not alone. Susie Carter hadn't wanted to move to Ashford Springs, Georgia, the small town, nestled in the foothills 40 miles outside Atlanta, was everything. Her previous home in Detroit wasn't quiet, insular, and steeped in the kind of old Southern traditions that made her mother nervous. But after her father's construction company went under and her parents' marriage followed suit, her mother had taken the only nursing job she could find at Ashford General Hospital. That's how Zara, at 16, found herself walking through the doors of Willowbrook Academy, the town's only private school, on a full academic scholarship that covered tuition but couldn't buy acceptance. Willowbrook Academy sat on 20 acres of manicured grounds, its red brick buildings and white columns a testament to old money and older prejudices. The student parking lot gleamed with BMWs and Mercedes, while Susie took the city bus that stopped 3 blocks away, her natural hair, worn in a crown of tight coils that defied the school's neat and professional grooming standards, marked her as different from the moment she arrived. In a student body of 800, she was one of only 37 black students, and the only one who didn't come from the wealthy black families who'd integrated Ashford Springs' upper echelons decades ago. Preston Hawthorne ruled Willowbrook like his family ruled Ashford Springs. His great-grandfather had founded Hawthorne Industries, the chemical plant that employed a third of the town. His father sat on every board that mattered, from the country club to the hospital where Zara's mother worked. His mother chaired the school board and had personally overseen Willowbrook's diversity initiative, the same program that had brought Susie to their hallowed halls. At 17, Preston stood 6'3", with the kind of athletic build that came from private trainers and protein shakes. His sandy blonde hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes always perfectly pressed, and his smile always perfectly cruel when he identified a new target. Preston's crew consisted of Davis Chen, whose parents owned the largest commercial real estate firm in 3 counties, and Tyler Brennan, whose father ran the investment firm that managed half the town's wealth. They moved through Willowbrook's halls like sharks through water, students parting before them in waves of deference and fear. In his 3 years at the school, Preston had driven out 12 scholarship students through campaigns of harassment so sophisticated they left no trace the administration could act on. He called it maintaining standards. Everyone else called it survival of the richest. Susie first appeared on Preston's radar during her second week in AP Chemistry. Dr. Patricia Morse had asked students to partner up for a lab experiment on molecular bonding. Zara, still learning the social geography of Willowbrook, had approached Madison Price, one of the popular girls who seemed friendlier than most. Madison had looked at Zara's extended hand like it was contaminated, then loudly announced, "I already have a partner," before turning to link arms with a girl who'd been sitting alone. The rejection echoed through the classroom, followed by snickers from Preston's corner. "Looks like diversity doesn't mean inclusion." Preston had stage, whispered to Davis. "Loud enough for everyone to hear. Maybe they should add a remedial social skills class to that scholarship package." Susie had found a partner in Kevin Liu, another scholarship student who'd learned to navigate Willowbrook by becoming invisible, but Preston had marked her as a target, and at Willowbrook, Preston's attention was a death sentence. The campaign started subtly. Susie would find her locker accidentally jammed with gum. Her textbooks would disappear from her bag during lunch, only to reappear water-damaged in the lost and found. Someone created an Instagram account called Willowbrook Watchdog that posted photos of her waiting at the bus stop with captions like, "Spotted, scholarship charity case, can't afford parking pass." The account had 300 followers within a day, all anonymous, all vicious in their comments about her hair, her clothes, her audacity to exist in their space. Susie documented everything in a small notebook, following the advice her mother had given her. These people have lawyers. Baby, you need evidence. She screenshotted posts, saved security footage timestamps, kept the damaged textbooks. She'd tried reporting the harassment to her guidance counselor, Mr. James Morrison, a nervous man who sweated through his shirts by 10 a.m. and clearly wished he worked anywhere else. "I understand you're having some adjustment difficulties," Morrison had said, not meeting her eyes. "But you have to understand, these are good kids from good families. Sometimes what feels like harassment is just high-spirited behavior. Have you tried joining some clubs, making friends? Maybe if you made more of an effort to fit in." The message was clear. You're on your own. The escalation came in stages, each more bold than the last. Preston discovered that Zara's mother worked at the hospital his family's foundation supported. During a particularly cruel lunch period, he'd stood on a cafeteria table and announced a fundraiser for underprivileged hospital workers, making sure everyone knew exactly whose mother he meant. He'd actually collected $47 in wadded bills and loose change, which he'd tried to force into Zara's hands, while Davis filmed and Tyler provided commentary about accepting charity gracefully. Susie had let the money fall to the floor and walked away, her spine straight and her eyes dry. But inside she was calculating. These boys thought cruelty was a game because they'd never faced consequences. They believed money could buy them immunity from karma. They were about to learn otherwise. The thing about Susie that Preston and his crew never bothered to discover was that she wasn't just smart, she was strategic. Growing up in Detroit had taught her that survival sometimes meant playing a longer game. She'd watched her father's business crumble, not from lack of skill, but from lack of connections. Seen how the systems designed to help people like them were rigged to fail. She'd learned to document, to plan, to wait for the perfect moment to strike, and she'd been building her case against Preston Hawthorne for weeks. She'd discovered that Davis Chen's parents were under federal investigation for tax evasion, a fact carefully hidden from Willowbrook's administration. She'd found Tyler Brennan's sealed juvenile record from his previous school in Charlotte, where he'd been expelled for assault, but Daddy's lawyers had made it disappear. And Preston had a secret that would destroy his family's reputation more thoroughly than any scandal. He'd been paying Marcus Thompson, the only black player on Willowbrook's basketball team, to take his SATs. Susie had the Venmo receipts, the text messages, and most damning, a recording of Preston bragging about it to Davis in what he thought was an empty classroom. But Susie wasn't ready to deploy her nuclear option yet. She wanted Preston to escalate, to do something so public and undeniable that when she destroyed him, no amount of money or influence could save him. She didn't have to wait long. It started on a Tuesday morning in early October. Susie had worn her hair in a particularly magnificent style, her coils defined and glistening with coconut oil, pulled up into a pineapple puff that added 3 inches to her height. She'd noticed Preston staring at her throughout their shared English literature class, his expression darker than usual. Madison Price had complimented Zara's hair in the hallway, rare moment of kindness, and Preston had seen it as a betrayal of the social order he enforced. "Your hair is so big," Preston had said as class ended. His voice carrying that dangerous undertone Susie had learned to recognize. Doesn't it get in the way? Block other people's view? Some might say it's inconsiderate. Some might say a lot of things. Susie had replied calmly. Packing her books. Doesn't make them worth listening to. The direct challenge hung in the air. Students who'd been rushing to leave suddenly slowed. Sensing drama brewing, Preston's face flushed. He wasn't used to victims who talked back. You know, he said, stepping closer. At Willowbrook, we have standards, traditions, ways of doing things that people like you might not understand. People like me? Zara's voice was steady, but her hand moved subtly to her phone, activating the recording app. You mean scholarship students? I mean people who don't belong. Preston's mask of civility was slipping. People who should be grateful they're even allowed through these doors instead of trying to change things with their ghetto hairstyles and attitudes. The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several students gasped. Even Davis looked uncomfortable. But Preston was too angry to care about witnesses. Careful. Preston, Susie said quietly. Your privilege is showing. That's when Preston snapped. Maybe it was the calm way she'd said it, or the fact that other students were clearly on her side, or simply that for the first time in his life, someone he considered beneath him wasn't cowering. He stormed out. But Susie could see the storm building in his eyes. She knew he'd retaliate. She was counting on it. The next morning, Wednesday, October 15th, Susie arrived at school at 7:45 a.m. to find Preston waiting by her locker with Davis and Tyler. Something was different about their formation. The way they stood, with military precision. Preston's hands hidden behind his back. The hallway was suspiciously crowded, for so early in the morning word had spread that something was going down. Morning, Zara, Preston said with a smile that reminded her of a snake before it strikes. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about standards, and I realized you're right. I should be more direct about maintaining them. That's when he brought his hands forward, revealing the industrial scissors from the art room, the kind used to cut through thick fabric and cardboard. Their blades gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The crowd collectively inhaled. Someone whispered, he wouldn't, but Susie could see in Preston's eyes that he'd convinced himself this was justified. Even noble putting her in her place, teaching her a lesson about challenging the natural order. See? I realize the problem isn't you, Preston continued, his voice taking on the quality of someone who'd rehearsed this speech. It's that hair. It's too loud, too defiant, too much. And sometimes, when something doesn't fit, you have to cut it down to size. He moved faster than Susie expected, his athlete's reflexes serving him well. Before she could fully dodge, he'd grabbed a section of her hair knot gently, but with the rough grip of someone who'd never been taught to see black hair as anything but alien. The scissors flashed, and suddenly a significant chunk of Zara's carefully maintained coils fell to the floor. The sound they made hitting the linoleum seemed to echo in the sudden, absolute silence that followed. 200 students stood frozen, their phones held up but forgotten, as if they couldn't quite process what they'd just witnessed. Preston stood there, scissors still in hand, a section of Zara's hair at his feet, his expression shifting from triumph to something like confusion as he registered the complete stillness of his victim. Susie hadn't screamed. She hadn't cried. She hadn't even flinched. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on Preston's face with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step back. The silence stretched 5 seconds. 10. 15. Students began to shift uncomfortably. The air itself seemed to thicken with tension. Then Susie smiled. It wasn't a happy smile or a sad smile or even an angry smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just been handed exactly what they'd been waiting for, wrapped in a bow of Preston's own arrogance. Thank you, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hallway. You just made this so much easier. Preston's confidence cracked. Made what easier? Everything, Susie said simply. She bent down and carefully collected the cut hair from the floor, placing it in a Ziploc bag she pulled from her backpack, a backpack that Preston now noticed with growing unease. She'd positioned carefully to capture the entire incident on the small camera clipped to its strap. You see, Susie continued, standing back up with that same unsettling calm. Assault with a weapon on school property is a felony in Georgia. Add in the hate crime enhancement, yes. Preston, calling my hair ghetto right before attacking it makes this a hate crime and you're looking at serious time. But here's the really interesting part. She pulled out her phone and Preston's face went pale as he recognized his own voice playing back from yesterday's recording. People like you, ghetto hairstyles. That establishes pattern and intent. Susie explained as if teaching a class. But wait, there's more. With a few taps, she pulled up something on her screen that made Davis Chen stumble backward. Davis, did you know your parents' tax evasion trial starts next month? Probably want to keep a low profile until then? And Tyler, she swiped to another screen. Charlotte Reform School has such interesting records, don't they? Tyler's face had gone from red to white to green in the span of seconds. How did you? But you, Preston, Susie said, turning back to the ringleader with that same deadly calm smile. You're my favorite. Should we discuss your SAT arrangement with Marcus here? Or would you prefer someplace more private? I'm sure the 300 students watching us live stream right now would love to hear how Willowbrook Academy's golden boy bought his way into Harvard. The scissors clattered to the floor as Preston's hand began to shake around them. The crowd was no longer silent. Whispers rose like a tide. Phones swinging between Preston's stricken face and Zara's composed one. Someone had indeed been live streaming, and the viewer count was climbing rapidly. You can't prove, Preston started. Venmo receipts, text messages, and a full recording of you bragging about it. Susie interrupted, all backed up in multiple locations, ready to be sent to Harvard admissions, the College Board, the FBI's Education Fraud Division, and oh, she smiled wider, your father's biggest business rivals at Brennan Industries. I'm sure they'd love to know that the Hawthorne heir is a cheater and a criminal. Principal Edwards' voice boomed down the hallway. What is going on here? The crowd parted to reveal the principal, flanked by 2 security guards, their faces grim as they took in the scene. Preston with the scissors at his feet, Zara's visibly damaged hair, and 200 witnesses with cameras. He assaulted me with a weapon, Susie said clearly, holding up the bag with her cut hair. I want to press charges. Now, let's not be hasty, Principal Edwards began, his political instincts kicking in. I'm sure this was just a misunderstanding. No, Susie cut him off. It was assault with witnesses. And if this school tries to cover it up, like you've covered up everything else Preston's done, I'll make sure every news outlet in Georgia knows that Willowbrook Academy protects criminals as long as their parents donate enough money. The principal's face cycled through several shades of purple. Preston looked like he might vomit. The crowd was growing larger as news spread through the school at digital speed. That's when Madison Price stepped forward from the crowd. Beautiful, popular Madison, who'd rejected Zara's partnership in chemistry, who'd never spoken up before. I saw everything, she said quietly. Preston assaulted her. We all saw it. One by one. Other students began to speak up. I saw it too. He had scissors. He called her hair ghetto. This isn't the first time. The dam broke. Stories poured out years of Preston's harassment. The students he'd driven away. The culture of fear he'd created. Even some of his own crew's victims found their voices, emboldened by Zara's courage and the safety of numbers. Preston's world unraveled in real time. His phone buzzed incessantly. The live stream had gone viral. Tagged with number Willowbrook scandal and number cut down to prejudice, Harvard admissions would see it. His father's business partners would see it. Everyone would see the golden boy revealed as a common bully and criminal. But Susie wasn't done. As security moved to escort Preston to the office, she called out, "Oh, Preston, one more thing." He turned, his face a mask of impotent rage and fear. "My hair will grow back," she said, running her hand over the damaged section with dignity. "Your reputation won't?" The hallway erupted in scattered applause that built to thunder. Preston was led away, his shoulders shaking, whether with rage or tears. No one could tell. Davis and Tyler had vanished, probably already on the phone with their parents' lawyers. Principal Edwards approached Susie cautiously. "Miss Carter, I think we should discuss planed 9th mated from the .com. Yes?" Susie agreed. "Let's discuss how Willowbrook Academy is going to handle its systemic racism problem. Let's discuss how you've enabled bullies like Preston for years. Let's discuss the changes that need to happen immediately. Or I'll be discussing it with CNN instead. They've already reached out." She held up her phone, showing a direct message from a verified news account. The principal's political smile faltered entirely. Students were still filming, still posting, still spreading the story. Number Zara Carter was trending. The video of Preston cutting her hair had been viewed 50,000 times in 10 minutes. Comments poured in from around the country, praising her composure, her intelligence, her strategic brilliance in taking down a bully who thought he was untouchable. But in that moment, standing in a hallway littered with the remnants of her beautiful hair, surrounded by hundreds of students who finally saw her not as an outsider, but as someone who'd freed them all from Preston's reign of terror, Susie felt something more powerful than vindication. She felt the weight of her ancestors who'd fought bigger battles with fewer weapons, who'd faced down hatred with dignity and strategy. Her damaged hair wasn't a loss, it was a battle scar that told the story of how she'd turned Preston Hawthorne's weapon against him, how she'd transformed an act of racist violence into the catalyst for his complete destruction. The bell rang for first period, but no one moved. Everyone was waiting to see what Susie would do next. She picked up her backpack, checked that her camera was still recording evidence was everything, and walked through the crowd that parted for her like she was royalty. Because in a way, she was. She'd done what no one else had managed in Preston's 3-year reign. She'd beaten him not with violence or money or connections, but with patience, intelligence, and the kind of courage that comes from knowing you're fighting for more than just yourself. As she passed Madison Price, the girl who'd rejected her partnership weeks ago, Madison whispered, "I'm sorry. For everything." Susie paused, considering. Your apology would mean more if it came with action. There are 37 black students in this school. We need allies, not just apologies. Madison nodded, tears in her eyes. "Tell me what to do." "First," Susie said, "help me document every incident of racism and bullying in this school. We're not stopping with Preston. This whole system needs to change." By the time Susie reached her first period class, her phone had logged 300 text messages of support, 57 media requests, and one very special call from Spelman College offering her a full scholarship for showing exceptional leadership in the face of adversity. Her mother had texted frantically after seeing the video at work, oscillating between pride and terror. But the most satisfying notification was from Marcus Thompson. The basketball player Preston had paid off. "Thank you for setting me free. I'm ready to tell the truth about everything." The war for Willowbrook Academy's soul had begun with a pair of scissors and a racist boy's arrogance, but it would end with something far more powerful: truth, courage, and a young black woman who refused to let anyone cut her down to size. As Susie settled into her seat, she touched the uneven edges of her hair and smiled. Preston had tried to humiliate her by taking her crown. Instead, he'd helped her claim her throne. The news cycle moved faster than Preston Hawthorne's fall from grace. By lunch that Wednesday, number Willowbrook scandal had reached 2 million views, with major news outlets picking up the story. "Private school prince commits hate crime on camera," read the CNN Chiron, while Fox News debated whether Zara's response represented admirable composure or calculated entrapment. But in Willowbrook Academy's administrative conference room, the only sound was Preston's father's voice, tight with barely controlled rage. "This is a misunderstanding," Richard Hawthorne said, his $2,000 suit impeccable even as his world crumbled. "Boys will be boys. A prank taken too far. Perhaps, but hardly worthy of—" "Your son assaulted a student with a weapon," Principal Edwards interrupted. Surprising. Everyone with his sudden spine. The viral video had made covering for Preston impossible, and Edwards was nothing if not a survivor. On camera, after making racist statements, also on camera, the board has already called an emergency meeting. The board I donate $3 million to annually? Richard's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. The same board that's currently fielding calls from the NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Edwards replied, "Your money can't fix this?" Richard. Across town, in the modest apartment she shared with her mother, Susie Carter sat at their kitchen table surrounded by notebooks, printed screenshots, and 3 phones that wouldn't stop ringing. Her mother, Denise, still in her hospital scrubs from a 12-hour shift, alternated between pride and panic. "Baby, are you sure about this?" Denise asked, watching her daughter field yet another interview request. "These people have power. Real power. They could make our lives. They already tried to make my life hell." "Mama," Susie said, her hand unconsciously touching the uneven section of her hair. "The difference is, now, everyone's watching." Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Susie almost ignored it, then saw the message preview. "This is Marcus Thompson. Can we talk? I have information about Preston you need to know." Susie met Marcus at a coffee shop downtown. Away from Willowbrook's sphere of influence, the basketball star looked smaller than his 6'5" frame suggested, shoulders hunched with the weight of secrets. He slid a flash drive across the table before Susie could even say hello. "Everything's on there," Marcus said quietly. "Not just the SAT fraud. Preston's been running a whole operation. Falsified transcripts, plagiarized essays for college applications, even bribing teachers to change grades. Davis and Tyler were in on it, but Preston was the ringleader. They called it the Legacy Protection Program." Zara's eyes widened as she scrolled through the files on her laptop. This is massive. "How many students?" 43 over 3 years, Marcus replied. "All wealthy kids whose parents couldn't accept their darlings were average students." Preston charged $50,000 per package grade changes. Test fraud. Fake extracurriculars. The works. He kept detailed records because he thought he was untouchable. "Why are you giving this to me?" Susie asked, studying Marcus's face. "Because what you did today, standing up to him like that?" Marcus's voice cracked. "I've wanted to do that for 2 years. Ever since he found out I needed money for my mom's cancer treatment and turned me into his personal test taker, you gave me the courage to finally fight back." By Thursday morning, Willowbrook Academy was in full crisis mode. The parking lot swarmed with news vans, their satellites reaching toward the sky like mechanical prayers. Parents who usually glided through life with entitled confidence now scurried past reporters, designer sunglasses failing to hide their shame. The Department of Education had announced a formal investigation. Harvard had released a statement about reviewing admissions for all Willowbrook graduates from the past 5 years. Inside the school, the atmosphere was electric with change. Students who'd lived in fear of Preston and his crew walked taller. The scholarship kids who'd been invisible suddenly found themselves centers of attention, their stories finally being heard. In the cafeteria where Preston had once held court, Susie now sat surrounded by a diverse group of students planning what they called the Willowbrook Revolution. "We need a complete culture audit," said Jennifer Patel, a junior who'd been bullied for her accent until she'd learned to speak in perfectly modulated tones. "Every teacher, every policy, every tradition that enables discrimination, and a peer accountability system," added Kevin Liu, Zara's chemistry partner who'd emerged from invisibility with a vengeance. "No more reporting to administrators who look the other way. We police ourselves." Madison Price, who'd undergone the most dramatic transformation, suggested, "What about a diversity and inclusion student board with actual power? Not just advisory?" Susie nodded, taking notes. "All good. But first, we need to deal with Preston's co-conspirators." As if summoned by their names, Davis Chen and Tyler Brennan appeared in the cafeteria doorway. They looked like ghosts of their former selves. Davis's usual designer confidence, replaced by visible anxiety. Tyler's bulk somehow diminished. They approached Zara's table like condemned prisoners approaching the gallows. "We want to make a deal," Davis said without preamble. The cafeteria fell silent. Everyone waited to see how Susie would handle this. "I don't make deals with people who terrorized my friends," Susie replied calmly, "but I believe in redemption. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to confess everything, and I mean everything, to the authorities. You're going to return every cent you made from Preston's scheme. And you're going to spend the rest of your time at Willowbrook working to undo the damage you caused." "Or?" Tyler asked, trying to summon some of his old bravado. "Or I release everything I have on both of you, and you can join Preston in facing federal charges." Susie said simply, "Your choice?" They chose confession. The next weeks unfolded like a Shakespearean drama. Davis Chen's parents, already under federal investigation, saw their son's involvement in the Willowbrook scandal as the final straw. Their real estate empire crumbled as partners fled and loans were called in. Tyler Brennan's father shut down his investment firm rather than face the scrutiny that was coming. Both boys were expelled but avoided criminal charges in exchange for their cooperation. Preston Hawthorne wasn't so lucky. The assault charges were just the beginning. The FBI's Education Fraud Division, armed with Marcus's evidence and Davis and Tyler's testimony, built a RICO case that implicated not just Preston, but several parents who'd knowingly participated in the scheme. Richard Hawthorne hired the best lawyers money could buy, but no amount of legal maneuvering could overcome video evidence, financial records, and multiple witnesses. On a cold November morning, Preston Hawthorne was arrested at his family's estate. The image of him in handcuffs, being led past the same reporters he'd once charmed at school events, became the defining photo of the scandal. He was charged with assault with a hate crime enhancement, racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. His Harvard admission was revoked. His trust fund was frozen pending investigation. His family name, once synonymous with power in Ashford Springs, became radioactive. But the real transformation happened at Willowbrook Academy itself. The emergency board meeting lasted 12 hours. When it ended, Principal Edwards had submitted his resignation, effective immediately. 3 board members stepped down. The others, shell-shocked by the federal scrutiny and public outrage, approved every reform. Susie and her coalition proposed Dr. Angela Morrison, a black woman with a PhD in education and a background in restorative justice, was brought in as the new principal. Her first act was to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, chaired by Susie Carter. The committee's mandate was to investigate every claim of discrimination, bullying, or harassment from the past decade and recommend systemic changes. The stories that emerged were heartbreaking. Scholarship students described years of torment. Students of color shared experiences of casual racism disguised as tradition. LGBTQ students revealed harassment that teachers had dismissed as boys being boys or girls being dramatic. International students talked about xenophobia masked as helping them assimilate. Each story was documented, witnessed, and validated. More importantly, each story led to concrete changes. The dress code that had policed black hair and cultural dress was rewritten. The disciplinary system that had punished victims who fought back while protecting aggressors with connections was overhauled. The curriculum that had centered exclusively on white authors and European history was diversified. Zara, meanwhile, had become something she'd never expected: famous. Her handling of Preston had been taught in sociology classes as an example of strategic resistance. She'd been invited to speak at conferences about youth activism. Spelman College had increased their scholarship offer and added a campus leadership position. Publishers wanted her to write a book. Netflix was developing a documentary. But fame brought its own challenges. Death threats arrived from white supremacist groups who saw her as a symbol of everything they hated. The Hawthorne family's lawyers tried to paint her as a manipulative opportunist who'd entrap their client. Conservative media outlets dissected her every word and looking for ammunition. Susie handled it all with the same calm that had unnerved Preston in that hallway. She hired security with the money from her speaking engagements. She let Willowbrook's new legal team handle the Hawthorne lawyers. She ignored the media noise and focused on the work. 6 months after the scissors incident, Willowbrook Academy was unrecognizable. The student body, once segregated by invisible lines of race and class, had integrated into genuine community. The hallways that had been hunting grounds for predators like Preston now buzzed with collaborative energy. Test scores were oopit. Turned out that students performed better when they weren't living in fear. Marcus Thompson, freed from Preston's grip, had raised his grades legitimately and earned a basketball scholarship to Duke on his own merits. He'd become an advocate for student athletes' rights, speaking out about exploitation and academic fraud. His testimony had been crucial in the federal case against Preston. Madison Price had undergone perhaps the most profound transformation. The former Queen Bee had become co-chair of the new Student Alliance for Equity and Justice. She used her social influencer, directed toward positive change, to make inclusivity cool. When her old friends from other private schools mocked her transformation, she'd replied simply, "I decided I'd rather be on the right side of history." Even some of the teachers who'd enabled the old system found redemption. Mr. Morrison, the guidance counselor who'd dismissed Zara's complaints, voluntarily entered sensitivity training and returned as an effective advocate for marginalized students. He'd apologized to Susie personally, acknowledging his complicity in a system that had failed her and so many others. The ripple effects spread beyond Willowbrook. Other private schools in Georgia, terrified of similar scandals, proactively implemented reforms. The state legislature passed Zara's Law, requiring all schools to maintain independent reporting systems for discrimination and harassment. The College Board implemented new security measures to prevent the kind of fraud Preston had orchestrated, but perhaps the most surprising transformation was Preston Hawthorne himself. In federal prison, stripped of his privilege and power, Preston experienced what his victims had felt: helplessness, fear, isolation. His fellow inmates, many of them from backgrounds he'd mocked and dismissed, showed him more humanity than he'd ever shown them. A black inmate named Jerome taught him chess and talked to him about redemption. A Latino man named Miguel shared books that opened Preston's eyes to experiences beyond his bubble. The letters started arriving at Zara's apartment 8 months after his sentencing. The first one was short, formal, clearly written with lawyers watching. "Miss Carter, I write to offer my sincere apologies for my actions. I take full responsibility for the harm I caused. Sincerely, Preston Hawthorne." Susie didn't respond. The letters kept coming, each one longer, more personal, less polished. "I dream about that morning sometimes, not about getting caught, but about the sound your hair made hitting the floor. I wake up sick with myself. How did I become someone who could do that to another human being?" And later, Jerome says redemption isn't just saying sorry, it's doing the work. "I'm trying to do the work. I'm teaching literacy to other inmates. I'm reading books by black authors. I'm learning about the history they never taught us at Willowbrook. I'm beginning to understand what you meant about systemic racism. I was the system." After 6 months of letters, Susie finally wrote back, "Your journey to redemption is not my responsibility to validate. Focus on becoming better for its own sake, not for forgiveness. Some things can't be undone, only learned from." Preston's response surprised her. "You're right. I'm not writing for forgiveness anymore. I'm writing because someone should document what privilege does to a person's soul, how it rots you from inside until cruelty feels like entitlement. Maybe my story can prevent another Preston." Enclosed is a essay I've written. Do whatever you want with it. The essay, titled "Anatomy of a Racist Bully, a Self-Autopsy," was brutally honest, Preston dissected his upbringing. The subtle and overt messages that had taught him he was superior. The way his parents' money had insulated him from consequences until consequences came with handcuffs. He analyzed how each act of cruelty had made the next easier. How surrounding himself with enablers had normalized evil. Susie sat on the essay for weeks before deciding to publish it on Medium with Preston's permission. It went viral, sparking conversations about privilege, redemption, and whether people who'd done terrible things could truly change. Some saw it as genuine growth. Others dismissed it as manipulation. Susie stayed neutral, letting Preston's words speak for themselves. A year after the scissors incident, Willowbrook Academy held its first day of restoration. It wasn't a celebration, Susie had insisted on that. It was a day of reflection, education, and commitment to continued growth. The morning assembly featured speakers who'd been victims of the old culture. The afternoon held workshops on allyship, anti-racism, and building inclusive communities. Susie gave the keynote address to an audience that included students, faculty, parents, and media. She stood at the podium, her hair fully regrown and styled in a magnificent afro that seemed to catch and hold light. The uneven section Preston had cut had been incorporated into an asymmetrical style that she'd made her signature, a daily reminder that damage could become distinction. A year ago, someone tried to cut me down to size, she began, her voice carrying the strength of someone who'd found her power. He thought my hair was too big, too black, too bold. He was right about one thing: it was bold. Bold enough to threaten his narrow worldview. Bold enough to challenge systems built on exclusion. Bold enough to refuse shrinking for anyone's comfort. She paused, looking out at the sea of facesso, different from the homogeneous crowd that had filled these seats before. But this isn't my victory story. This is our transformation story. Every person who stood up that day in the hallway, who finally said, "Enough," every student who shared their truth with the committee, every teacher who chose growth over comfort, every parent who chose justice over privilege, we did this together. The speech continued for 20 minutes, weaving together themes of justice, redemption, community, and the ongoing work of anti-racism. But it was her conclusion that would be quoted in graduation speeches and civil rights conferences for years to come. Preston Hawthorne thought he was cutting my hair. In reality, he was cutting the last thread that held up a rotten system. When powerful people assault those they see as powerless, they reveal the weakness of their power. Real strength doesn't need scissors or schemes or subjugation. Real strength stands in truth, builds in community, and grows like hair naturally, boldly, unapologetically. She touched her afro, that magnificent crown that had become her trademark. They can try to cut us down, but we will always grow back stronger. And each time we grow, we make space for others to grow with us. That's not just resistance, that's revolution. That's not just my story, that's our story. And we're just getting started. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. In the crowd, Marcus Thompson wiped tears from his eyes. Madison Price hugged Jennifer Patel. Even Mr. Morrison, the formerly ineffective guidance counselor, stood tall with newfound purpose. The cameras captured it all, this moment when a school that had symbolized everything wrong with American education became a beacon of what was possible. Later that evening, as Susie packed up her apartment to head to Spelman College, her mother helped her sort through the piles of letters, awards, and memories from the year. They found the plastic bag with the hair Preston had cut. Still sealed. Still evidence. "What do you want to do with this?" Denise asked. Susie held the bag up to the light, studying the coils that had started everything. Then she smiled, not the cold smile she'd given Preston in the hallway, but something warm and free. "Let's bury it in the garden," she said. "Let something beautiful grow from it." As they stood in their small garden plot, placing the hair in the earth like seeds of change, Susie thought about Preston in his cell, writing his essays about redemption. She thought about Willowbrook, transformed from a bastion of privilege into a model of inclusive education. She thought about all the young people who'd messaged her, saying her story had given them courage to stand up to their own bullies. Change was possible. Systems could be dismantled. People could transform. Sometimes it took scissors and stupidity to start a revolution. Sometimes it took a young woman refusing to shrink. Sometimes it took a community choosing courage over comfort. Susie Carter had entered Willowbrook Academy as a scholarship student who just wanted to get an education. She left as a catalyst who'd changed the course of hundreds of lives. Her hair had grown back, fuller and more glorious than before. But more importantly, she'd grown into a leader, an activist, a voice for those still finding theirs. The girl who'd been told she didn't belong had rebuilt the entire definition of belonging. The hair that had been cut to humiliate her had become a symbol of resistance. The whisper of scissors had become a roar of revolution. And in schools across the country, when bullies reached for their metaphorical scissors, their victims remembered Susie Carter, the girl who'd turned an assault into an uprising, who'd transformed trauma into triumph, who'd proven that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is the devastating force of truth delivered with perfect calm. Preston Hawthorne had tried to cut her down to size. Instead, she'd risen to legendary heights, pulling everyone ready to rise with her. Her crown had been touched, but never taken. Her power had been tested, but never broken. And in the end, the boy with the scissors learned what Susie had always known. Real crowns aren't worn on heads or cut with blades. They're carried in spirits that refuse to bow, grown in hearts that refuse to hate, and shared with communities that refuse to let anyone stand alone. The revolution that started with scissors would be remembered, but Susie Carter, the girl who stared down hatred and won would be legendary. The revolution that started with scissors would be remembered, but Susie Carter, the girl who stared down hatred and won would be legendary. 5 years later, at her college graduation, Susie stood before another crowd as Spelman's valedictorian. In the audience sat an unexpected guest, Preston Hawthorne, now 23, recently released and working at a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated youth. He'd written asking if he could attend, promising to stay invisible. Susie had responded with 2 words, bear witness. As she delivered her valedictory address, Zara's eyes found his in the crowd. He looked different, humbled, purposeful, carrying his past without letting it define his future. When she spoke about redemption being possible but not guaranteed, about growth requiring discomfort, about justice, including room for transformation, Preston nodded, understanding these weren't just words but lived truths. After the ceremony, they didn't speak, but as Preston left, he placed something on an empty chair, a small envelope. Inside, Susie found a check for $50,000 every cent he'd made from his schemes, now donated to the Susie Carter Scholarship Fund for students facing discrimination. The note simply read, "For every curl that grows back stronger." That night, as Susie celebrated with family and friends who'd multiplied since her Willowbrook days, she thought about circle show harm could create healing, how breaking could lead to building, how one moment of cruelty had sparked a movement of courage. Her mother asked what she was thinking about. "How sometimes," Susie said, touching her graduation cap where it sat atop her glorious natural hair. "The worst things that happen to us become the best things that happen through us." The story of the girl whose hair was cut would be told for generations, but the story of the woman who grew from that girl that was still being written, one transformed life at a time. Say goodbye to your precious hair. I'll break your hand in 3. R. E.